For those who are curious about the offering video, that was actually from our church plant in Bago City. I guess I forgot to specify that before it started. And you may have even noticed I was in some of the pictures. I should have said, whoever can guess where I was at gets $1, but I don't have $1. So you guys just you can pat yourself on the back. But yeah, I was at the baptism. I was there going to propose, not at the baptism, but going to the Philippines to propose to my now fiance. And she was actually the one who made the video. But yeah, the Lord is doing some awesome things in the Philippines, and I'm really grateful that our church has wisely chosen to be a part of that, and just seeing how even just this year alone, over 1,000 people have come to the Lord because of that outreach in Bago City. So we're certainly grateful for that. All right, I had something else to say, and I was pinching myself too, but maybe it'll come to me later. All right, today's title is Baraka Vet Chala, I believe it is. It's Hebrew. It comes from the passage in Deuteronomy chapter 30, where Moses, who is about to die, is talking to the children of Israel, and he says to them that, hey, you guys are about to enter the land, a land which they had been anticipating their entire lives. He says there's going to be temptations, you're going to have choices to make, you're going to have to choose. Are you going to obey and follow God, or are you going to disobey and dishonor God? So he says, if you obey God, you'll be blessed. If you disobey God, you'll be cursed. So he says this passage, and he says, in this passage, I set before you life and death, blessings and curses. What I think Moses was trying to say was, depending on what you choose, depending on the decisions you make while you're in the land of Israel, will determine if God is going to bless you or if you're going to be cursed. And I believe that concept can be applied to any situation in life. I believe any situation can be either a blessing or a curse. It just depends on how we respond to that situation. Of course, I'm sure we can cite several different examples of situations where a good situation, a blessed situation, turned into a curse. We can think of Solomon, a man who was blessed with all this wisdom, all this wealth, but unfortunately he made some pretty dumb mistakes, and he ended up using earthly wisdom, and he married the daughters of all these different kings, the surrounding nations, and such as Pharaoh's daughter. And I think one of the reasons he did that was to secure peace between them. You know, you're not going to attack me if I'm married to your daughter. So I think that was the reason. He did it for diplomatic reasons, but because he used earthly wisdom instead of heavenly wisdom, it ended up being a curse to him, because as his wives came into the land of Israel, they brought with them their false gods and their false teachings, and Solomon unfortunately started to fall for those things. So something that should have been a blessing became a curse. And then of course we can think of Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve, were they in a pretty cool situation? Yeah, they had everything they ever could have wanted, all the food they could have wanted. They had each other, they had God, they had purpose, they had everything that mankind would ever need and more. But yet, because of a decision that they made, because of they were in a situation where they could choose to be blessed or cursed, and unfortunately they chose to disobey God, and it ended up being a curse to them. But today we're not going to talk about how to turn a good situation bad, because that's not very helpful for us. I think we can do that on our own. Today we're going to talk about how to turn a bad situation into a blessing, because I believe any situation can be a blessing. I think God created it that way. God made life in such a way that any situation can be turned into a blessing. We may not like everything that happened during that situation, but I believe if we handle it correctly, it can be turned into a blessing. So anyone can obtain a blessing out of any situation. How? By learning the proper response from these various examples. All right. There's many examples throughout the Bible of God blessing through things such as discipline, through suffering, and through testing. Now, most of us, all of us probably, would say that discipline is not something that we necessarily want to happen to us, nor do we want suffering to happen to us, nor do we want to be tested. But discipline, one of the ways that God blesses through discipline is supposed to help us learn from our mistakes so that we don't make those mistakes again. Suffering, sometimes it's not necessarily a punishment, but sometimes we go through suffering, and it just happens to be that on the journey to a blessing, you have to go through some suffering, some inevitable suffering. And then there's testing. Sometimes God just wants to test us to show us how strong our faith is, and to show us where we need to improve in certain areas. All right, I guess I'm done. Shortest sermon. I decided you guys deserved a short sermon. You guys are so used to listening to my dad. No, just kidding. All right, so let's talk about that. Let's go a little broader. All right, blessings through discipline. We're going to go through Hebrews and Judges. There's various books that talk about discipline, but for the sake of time, we'll go through just two of them. All right, before we do, let's go ahead and go through a definition of discipline. I'm sure various people have different definitions of the word discipline, but we're going to go by my definition because I'm the one speaking. All right. I believe that discipline is a fair punishment that is intended for the benefit of the recipient by teaching them a valuable life lesson. So let's go a little deeper. It's a fair punishment. All right. So it's a punishment. It's not positive reinforcement. It's supposed to be negative reinforcement. So if someone didn't do something wrong and you can't just do something against them and say it's discipline. Discipline is only a punishment. It's only if they did something wrong. But it's not just a punishment. It's a fair punishment. So say you're like, hey, kid, take out the trash. And like, okay, hold on. And they keep playing their video games or keep texting. And then you go up to them and break their arm. Is that a fair punishment? No. First, take your kid to the hospital. Second, check yourself in as well. All right, so discipline is a fair punishment that is intended for the benefit of the recipient. If it's not intended for the benefit of the recipient, then you're just hurting them, and that's rude. So it has to be intended for their benefit. Let's give an example. Let's say you come home from work, or you're headed home from work, and you had a terrible day. Nothing was productive. Maybe your boss yelled at you saying you were worthless or something. So you just want to get home. So you're speeding a little bit, and then a cop pulls you over and gives you a ticket, which is discipline, by the way, because it's supposed to teach you not to speed. So that's considered discipline. But you get home, and you just got this headache. You've had a terrible day. You got your ticket now, and your kids are just giggling and laughing and being loud, and they're just being kids, not necessarily doing anything wrong, but you're just so frustrated, you're so tired, so you yell at them, send them to their room, tell them to stay there until they're older. Now, is that discipline? Well, no. It's not actually a punishment. They didn't do anything wrong. It's just you happen to be in a bad mood. And it's not necessarily intended for their benefit. So it's not discipline. It's not necessarily abuse unless you really do keep them there. But it's not discipline. So discipline has to be a fair punishment that is intended for the benefit of the recipient. Again, you guys may have different definitions for the word discipline, but that's fine. And it seems to be biblically founded, or at least somewhat. All right, in Hebrews chapter 12, verses 5 through 11, it says, "For those whom the Lord loves, he disciplines." Now we know when it comes to people we love, we want the best for them. We want to bless them. So when it says the ones who the Lord loves, he disciplines, obviously God knows that discipline will somehow bless us, will somehow benefit us. But not just that. We'll skip down to verse 7. "It is for discipline that you endure. God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline?" So now it's specifying. This isn't discipline. God's not disciplining us like a police officer would discipline you if you got a ticket. He's disciplining us like a father would discipline their child, just out of love. And keep reading, verse 8. "But if ye are without discipline, of which all have become partakers, then ye are illegitimate children and not sons." So in other words, if you're a child of God, you're going to be disciplined. Again, discipline is a punishment. It's not God's just going to hurt you if you're a child of God. If that was true, people probably wouldn't want to be a child of God. But it's not God's going to discipline you because he wants you to learn. But if God's not disciplining you, if you're living a sinful lifestyle or you're constantly in a certain sin and God's not punishing you at all, if you're not seeing any repercussions for your sin, then it may be you might want to reevaluate, is God really your father? Because it says that God disciplines those he loves and that God disciplines us as a father would. All right, verse 9. "Furthermore, we have earthly fathers to discipline us, and we respected them. Shall we not much rather be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time, as seemed best to them. But he disciplines us for our good." So it goes back to my definition. Discipline is for the benefit of the recipient. This seems to reiterate that. "So that we may share his holiness. All discipline for the moment seems not to be joyful, but sorrowful." I mean, that's obviously true. That's kind of the point. Discipline isn't positive reinforcement. Positive reinforcement is rewarding someone for a good behavior so that you can reinforce that behavior. Discipline is negative reinforcement. That's when you punish them so that you don't reinforce their behaviors. You reinforce them not doing that. So the point of discipline is to be painful. It's supposed to make you feel uncomfortable. So when we're being disciplined by God, it is painful. I don't know exactly. We get disciplined in different ways, but God knows exactly how to discipline us in a way to teach us. But during that time, I mean, let's say we're sitting in prison, we're like, wow, this is such a blessing. Or if you're a kid and you're like, wow, I'm getting disciplined by my parents. What a blessing. Can't wait to see how this will turn out. So anyways, during the actual discipline moment, we're not happy. But we can look to the future and know that, hey, this is there for a reason. And I highlighted this part, yet to those who have been trained by it. And I think that's key to reaching the blessing, to obtaining a blessing from discipline. To those who've been trained by it, to those who have learned from it. How many people, a lot of times they go to prison and they get out. Do they ever go back to prison? Yeah, a lot of people, unfortunately, they go back to prison. And it's not because they weren't disciplined properly, it's because they didn't learn from their discipline. So when we don't learn from our discipline, we're bound to make the same mistakes. So we can take this bad situation, whatever our discipline is, and we can say, well, I'm not going to learn from it. Well, then you're cursed to repeat it. But if you decide, I'm going to learn from it, I'm going to not make that same mistake again, for those who have been trained by it, those who have learned, afterwards it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness. So it's not until we learn from our discipline that we are able to be blessed by it. If we don't learn, we're cursed by it. If we do learn from it, then we are blessed by it. And that's God's intention. All right, let's go Book of Judges. I'm the youth pastor, and we were, a little while ago, the youth and I, we were going over the Book of Judges. And I came up with a cycle. I don't need to cite anyone because I came up with it myself, but I'm sure other people have come up with it too. It's just a super obvious cycle throughout the Book of Judges. And if you ever read the Book of Judges, it's very depressing because they keep making this cycle. All right. So they always went from freedom. They were following God. God had them in freedom. They were being blessed. To somehow they're like, oh, wait, we don't like this freedom anymore. So they go, let's go ahead and sin against God. So they go from sin, and after they sinned against God, God always disciplined them. And one of the ways he did that was by putting them in captivity, letting their enemies overcome them. And it wasn't until they were disciplined through captivity that they realized, oh, wait, when we were serving God, we had it pretty good. Maybe we've made a mistake. So they would repent of their mistakes. They would call out to God. They'd come back to God. God would raise up a deliverer, and the deliverer would deliver them. And then because of that, they would go into freedom where they would enjoy the freedoms from God's blessings as they served him. And then they would sin again, captivity, repentance, and the whole book just revolves around that kind of a cycle, unfortunately. So let's go ahead and give an example. Judges 3, verses 7 through 12. So at the introduction, I talked about Moses told them to obey God, and Moses was about to die. Now, when you get to Judges 3, Joshua had just died. So Joshua, the successor of Moses, has now died, and the children of Israel, who have been enjoying the freedoms within the land, are now about to make a dumb decision. Verse 7, and the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and forgot the Lord their God, and served Balaam and the groves, which I find to be a very unintelligent thing to do. So basically, they go into this land, and they overcome all the armies of this land, so they can say, our God is greater than all the gods of this land, because we overcame all the inhabitants of this land. But yet, they're like, let's go ahead and serve their gods instead, because that makes sense. But anyway, so they served their gods, and just like Moses predicted, God would get angry. Therefore, the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, and he sold them into the hands of Shushan-Rishathaim. Wow. King of I practiced that, by the way. King of Mesopotamia. And the children of Israel served Shushan-Rishathaim 8 years. All right, so now we go from freedom to sin, and now God's disciplining them by putting them into captivity. And when the children of Israel cried unto the Lord raised up a deliverer to the children of Israel, who delivered them, even Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. So Caleb, Joshua's right-hand man, his nephew, God just raised him up to become a judge and to deliver Israel. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he judged Israel, and went out to war. And the Lord delivered Shushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia, into his hands. And his hand prevailed against Shushan-Rishathaim. I think it's unnecessary how many times. I think personal pronouns would have been good. And he delivered him into his hands. But anyways. And the land had rest for 40 years. And Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died. So going back to our chart, we see they had freedom, then they sinned. God gave them into Shushan-Rishathaim. And then they repented. God made a deliverer, and now they're back into freedom. But what often happens in the book of Judges, as soon as the deliverer dies, and the children of Israel did evil again in the sight of the Lord. And the Lord strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, against Israel, because they had done evil in the sight of the Lord. So they went right back to sin, unfortunately. They did get 40 years of freedom, so that was cool. But then as soon as Othniel died, they went back to sin, and then captivity, and then they repent in a second. We're not going to go into that, but you guys get the idea. The cycle continues. But it's important to realize that it wasn't until God disciplined them that they came back to repentance and that they came back to God, in which they were able to enjoy the freedom, the blessings of serving God. So discipline is there for a reason. It has a purpose. It's supposed to teach us. It's supposed to show us how to get back to God, how to do the right thing. So is discipline good? Absolutely. Can discipline be a blessing? Yes. Can discipline be a curse? Yes. It just depends on how you respond. If you learn from it, then it's a blessing. If you don't, then it can be a curse. All right, blessings through suffering. If you go through the book of Proverbs, it gives you a lot of conditional statements like, if you do this, then this will happen. If you're a wise person, then you'll succeed. If you're a righteous person, you'll be blessed. If you're a wicked person, you'll be punished. If you're a fool, you'll not succeed. The opposite of succeed, fail. So then that's all good and awesome, but then when you get to stories like Job and Joseph and Daniel, when Proverbs says the wicked are the ones who will suffer, the righteous will be blessed, you get to books like these, like Daniel and Job, and you realize sometimes even the righteous are the ones who suffer. And Proverbs also says that. It's just usually we look at the good stuff. So not only sometimes the righteous suffer, sometimes our suffering isn't a result of discipline. It's not a punishment that we did. One good example is Joseph. As far as I can tell, Joseph, the Bible never mentions any of his sins. I'm sure he did sin, but as far as I can tell, the Bible never mentions any of his. You could say that he was kind of mean to his brother when he threw him in prison after his brother sold him into slavery. But that's either way. But the point is, Joseph was obeying what his father told him to do and going to get his brothers. And his brothers, as a result, his brothers threw him in a pit, and then they sold him as a slave. The Bible never indicates that was for disciplinary measures. That the Bible never says that God was punishing Joseph, but yet Joseph is suffering. His father thought he was dead, and even though Joseph did the right thing, and when he was Potiphar, his master's wife, Potiphar wasn't his master's wife, Potiphar's wife was trying to seduce Joseph, trying to get him for sexual reasons. He refused to do it. He refused to sin. And because of it, she falsely accused him, and he was thrown in prison. So again, him being thrown in prison, the Bible never indicates that this was a punishment for him, something that he did. Instead, it just seems as though, even though he was doing the right things, he was suffering. So sometimes the righteous suffer, not because they're being punished, but for another reason. So he was there for many years. He was forgotten in prison. However, Joseph, because of these things, was blessed. If he had not been sold as a slave to Egypt, he may never have gone to Egypt, in which he never would have been thrown in prison, which seems like a bad thing. But if he had never been thrown in prison, he never would have met one of Pharaoh's servants, who later told Pharaoh about Joseph. And Joseph, because he met Pharaoh, because he helped Pharaoh out, he became second in command of the greatest nation at that time. So he went from prison to second command of the entire nation, which made him the boss of his old boss, which was, I wonder what he did. But yeah, either way, he may not have done anything. So not only was Joseph blessed by getting all this authority and power, but he was also able to bless Egypt because there was a famine coming after 7 years, and Joseph was able to predict it because God blessed him with the ability to interpret dreams. So not only did he bless Egypt because he prepared them for the famine, but he also blessed his family because they were able, when the famine came, they had no food in their country, so they came to Egypt to get food. And that's where they prospered for another 400 years. But not only was he able to bless his family, but he was able to bless the surrounding nations as well, because the famine affected all the nations around them, and they came to Egypt for food. So because Joseph went through all that suffering, he was able to bless others, and he was able to himself be blessed. So sometimes our suffering is not because God is punishing us, but sometimes it's because on the journey to a blessing, you have to go through some suffering. That's not always true. Sometimes you can just be blessed from a good situation. But oftentimes, you have to go through suffering to reach the blessing. And God knows that. Daniel is another good example. By the way, the Bible, as far as I can tell, doesn't mention anything bad about Daniel. My name happens to be Joseph Daniel. I mean, I'm not making any predictions here. And both were able to predict dreams, so I like to sleep a lot, hoping that I'll catch on to that gift later. But anyway, so Daniel, again, the Bible never records anything bad about him. When I was in Israel, they asked someone, an Israeli local, wasn't Christian as far as I know, but they asked me, they said, "What's your name?" I said, "I'm Daniel." It's a Hebrew name, so I'm thinking, oh, I'm Daniel. And then they're like, "Oh." I'm like, "Yeah." They're like, "I don't normally hear the name Daniel in Hebrew." I'm like, "Well, it's in the Bible." They're like, "Huh, he must have done something terrible." I'm like, "No, pretty sure he didn't." But anyways, she thought because Daniel in the Bible must have done something terrible that nobody wants to name their kids Daniel. But they just probably don't feel like their kids are worthy enough to be called Daniel. So anyways, so my name's Daniel. All right, so Daniel, though the Bible never records, as far as I can tell, never records anything about him sinning, though I'm sure he did, but never indicates that any of the suffering in his life was a result of punishment from God. Yet he was kidnapped by foreign invaders, by a foreign power, taken from his family. We don't know anything that happened to his family. Were they killed? Were they sold as slaves? Were they just brought to Babylon? Were they sent back to Jerusalem? We don't know anything about it. We just know that Daniel was taken from his family. He survived a genocide of the wise men. And if you know the story, it's a very ridiculous story. Nebuchadnezzar's like, "You know what? The wise people weren't able to tell me what I dreamed, so I'm just going to kill all the smart people in my kingdom." See how well that works. Apparently, he did not seek counsel from the wise men for that decision. But anyways, Daniel was able to survive a genocide of wise men, and he was also sentenced to death by lions. All of these things, we look at them and think, was God trying to punish him? And even in the New Testament, we can see the concept of people having this understanding that when people are suffering, it's a punishment for their sin. When Peter, I think it was Peter and John, they were talking to Jesus and they saw someone, if I remember correctly, he was born blind, and they said, if he's born blind, then who sinned? Why is he suffering this way? Did his parents sin, or was it him who sinned? And Jesus reveals to them that not all suffering is a result of punishment. He says it's not, neither of them sinned or they sinned, but it's not a result of their sin. This is for the glory of God. So he's saying that it was meant to be a blessing later on. So Daniel is in the same situation. He's suffering not because he's being disciplined by God, but because God knows that there's a blessing at the end of this journey. Daniel is blessed every time he was almost killed. God turned that into an awesome blessing. He became the advisor of not just the king of Babylon, but also the king of Persia and the king of Medes. The name of God was pronounced throughout the kingdom because of Daniel. All of these things happened because Daniel had to go through suffering. So not all suffering is bad. I mean, it feels bad, just like Hebrews, the book of Hebrews said. All suffering feels bad at the time, but it's for greater good. It's for a blessing. All right, blessings through testing. Now we've talked about sometimes we're punished, and that's why we suffer. We're punished for our sins so that we can learn from it and not make the same mistake. Sometimes we go through suffering not because we're being punished, but because it's leading us to the blessing. And then other times we go through suffering because God is testing our faith so that we can see where our faith is at, where we need to improve, and things like that. One good example is Abraham. Abraham, we don't realize until later on in the story that Abraham actually came from a family who served false gods. So you might be wondering, why did God choose Abraham? Well, we know from when Samuel, the prophet, was about to anoint David to be king, God revealed to Samuel, as well as the readers, that God doesn't look at people like we look at people. God looks at their heart. So when God chose Abraham, obviously he knew something about Abraham, something in his heart that said, hey, I want this guy to be the father of many nations, to be the father of my chosen people. So God chose Abraham, and he told him, he said, hey, you don't have any kids right now. You're pretty old. But don't worry, I'm going to bless you with kids, with a son specifically. And Abraham's like, that's great. He believed God. But then years go by, and he has no son. And he kind of complains. He's like, God, I don't even have a son yet. And then God's like, don't worry, I'm going to bless you with a son. But Sarah's kind of iffy. Sarah, his wife, is kind of like, I'm pretty old. I'm in my 90s. Pretty sure I can't have kids anymore. So she says to Abraham, you should just have sex with my servant, and I'll just adopt the child. So Abraham does that, but then God comes back to Abraham and is very specific. It's not through that son that I'm going to bless you. It's through your son with you and Sarah, so with Isaac. Eventually, he does have a son named Isaac. And actually, some of you might not know, Abraham actually had several kids. Like after Sarah died, he remarried and had more kids. But Isaac is the only son that he had, the only child he had through Sarah. So God was very specific. It is through Isaac that I'm going to bless you. It's through Isaac that all the nations will be blessed. It's through him that I'm going to make you a great nation. So God's very specific. Isaac. Then God says, I want you to go sacrifice Isaac. So this can get very confusing for Abraham, I'm sure. He's probably thinking, you just told me you're going to bless me through Isaac. Now you're telling me you want me to give Isaac back to you through a human sacrifice. Now some of us, we kind of think, wow, Abraham was so awesome. He was willing to give his only son, to kill his only son and lose him forever. But that's not necessarily true. The point of the story is his faith that God could raise him back from the dead. So read Hebrews 11:17-19. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promise was offering up his only begotten son. It was he to whom it was said, in Isaac your descendants shall be called. So again, the verse is making it very clear that Abraham knew it was supposed to be through Isaac that he was going to be blessed. He considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, from which he also received him back as a type. So Abraham was willing to sacrifice his only son, knowing that God promised, this is the one who I'm going to bless you through. So he realized that if God's asking me to sacrifice my son, then obviously God has a plan to bring him back to me, which as far as I can tell, nowhere before that time had anyone been raised from the dead. In other places in the Old Testament, some people had been raised from the dead. In some places in the New Testament, they had been raised from the dead. But at this point, no one had been raised from the dead. So Abraham was taking a lot of faith, and he was willing to give God his son back, hoping that God would bring him back to life. And because of that, the whole world was blessed. Not just Abraham, though Abraham was blessed as well. After Abraham is about to sacrifice his son, which I think Isaac had the more faith there. Abraham's a pretty old guy, so pretty sure Isaac could outrun him. But whatever it was, whether Abraham tricked him or Isaac was just a very willing person, Abraham was about to sacrifice his son, and he was stopped. There was a ram stuck in the thicket, which was supposed to represent how Jesus would substitute our place, and they could sacrifice the lamb instead of humanity. So when Abraham was stopped and the angel told him, because you were willing to sacrifice your son to me, I'm going to bless you, and it's through Isaac that I'm going to bless you. And because of that decision, Isaac, who was a great, super great grandfather of Jesus, who would one day be the one that God would sacrifice for humanity, just like the sheep, the ram that was caught in the thicket, was sacrificed for Isaac Jesus was sacrificed for all of humanity. So it was because of Abraham's faith, it was because he passed the test of God, that he was able to bless the entire world. Job is another good example of someone who didn't deserve to suffer, but did. Job 1 verse 1. I discipled someone, his name was Christian, he was a cool guy. But he told me, he's like, Daniel, you know how, I think it's Romans 6:23 or 3:23. I get them mixed sometimes. He says, you know how it says all have sinned? I'm like, yeah. He's like, well, Job 1:1 says that Job was perfect. I'm like, well, it may not be saying that he was perfect as in he never sinned. In fact, Job, later on in the story, he talks about when his friends are accusing him, saying, you must have done something terrible. You deserve this punishment. He talks to him, he says, why are you talking to me like you're holding the transgressions of my youth against me? So it seems as though Job was saying that, yeah, I've sinned in the past, but that's not a result of this punishment here. So Job wasn't necessarily perfect as in he never sinned, but it may be saying he's perfect as in when he did sin, he was faithful to repent and to atone for it through sacrifices. In fact, in Job chapter 1, when we first see Job, do you know where he's at? He's making sacrifices, not for himself, but for his kids. Not because they did anything wrong, but he said just in case they thought something wrong. So Job is super faithful to make sacrifices to atone for any sins that he may have done or even that his family may have done. So he's making sacrifices for his whole family. So was he perfect as in he never sinned? Well, the Bible says that all have sinned, so probably not. But he may have been perfect as in he would continually repent for it, he would atone for it, and he would live a righteous life. In fact, God even describes him as a good man. And one day, God is in heaven. I guess he's always in heaven. He's omnipresent. But then Satan comes up, and God starts talking to Satan. And he mentions to Satan, he says, hey, have you noticed Job? He's like, there's no one in the world that's more perfect than him. He's my faithful servant. And Satan said, well, yeah, of course he's faithful to you. It's because you're giving him everything he wants. It's benefiting him to be faithful to you. But if you stop giving him what he wants, then he'll realize it's no longer benefiting him, and then he'll curse you and die. So God says, I'll tell you what, Satan, which I don't know why Satan's so stupid. I hope Satan didn't hear that. No, just kidding. People are like, I love it when people are like, oh, Satan's doing all these bad things. I'm like, I don't think Satan cares about me that much. He's only one dude. It probably doesn't get all the way to me. But no, I serve a God who's much greater than Satan, so we don't have to fear Satan. But the point is, Satan, he's just so stupid. Why is he trying to test God? Why is he trying to act like God doesn't know everything? It's like, oh, if you do this, then Job will curse you. Like God doesn't already know what's in Job's heart. Like God doesn't already know what's going to happen. So God's like, I'll tell you what, Satan, to prove to you that Job won't curse me, you can do whatever you want, except don't touch him. Don't curse his body. But you can put him through as much suffering as you want. So what he does is he puts him through an immense amount of suffering. He takes his children away. All 10 of his kids were killed. He takes all of his cattle away, which he was a very wealthy man when it came to cattle. He had like thousands and thousands of different animals. And so he took everything away from him. And then eventually, Job he worshiped God. He said, naked I came into this world, naked I'm going to return. So basically, I came in with nothing. Now I still have nothing. God is still good to me. So then God allows Satan to touch Job, in which Job, he lost his health. He started gaining boils all over his skin, in which the only way to be content, he was scraping his arms with like broken pots and stuff like that, trying to find some relief from the pain of the boils. So Job had it bad. He lost his family, he lost his wealth. His wife was very bitter. The person that you would hope would be very supportive of Job, would help him through this time, basically said, just curse God and die. I don't know if she was saying curse God and go kill yourself, which is very rude. But it may have just been she was saying curse God and just give up life. And then his friends, who also should have been helping him through this time, instead of helping him, instead of encouraging him, they basically started accusing him and mocking him, saying, you must be a terrible person for getting this kind of suffering. And Job keeps trying to tell them, I didn't do anything. I don't know why God's doing this, but it wasn't because of a sin I did. I've atoned for all these different things. But even though Job had no idea what was going on, and there was times where he complained to God. He's like, God, why are you doing this? It would have been better that I was never born. I mean, Job went through an intense amount of suffering. If there were two people who didn't deserve to go through suffering, it was Job and Jesus. And perhaps Job was foreshadowing of what would happen to Jesus, someone who didn't deserve to be punished but went through suffering anyways. So God, instead of telling Job, oh, it was a test, me and Satan were talking and I wanted to prove that you were a good, faithful servant. Congratulations, you passed. No, he says, were you there when I created the worlds? Were you there when this happened? Do you know this? Do you know that? Basically what God was saying was, you don't know everything and you don't need to know everything. You just have to trust me. And Job did trust God. And I like that in the Bible, it describes itself like a lamp instead of a spotlight. Because how many of us, we're going through these hard times, we're going through suffering, and we think, wow, I really wish that God would give me like a spotlight where I can look down farther down the journey, farther down the path, and see where this is leading us. So that I can say, oh, look, I can see the blessings up ahead. I'm just going to keep following this path because I know it's leading to a blessing. But instead, the Bible describes itself as a lamp that only shows us a little bit of the path, shows us enough to where we can take the next step, but that next step will be in faith. Just like Job, God tells us, I'm going to show you a little bit, enough to where you can take the next step, but I want you to trust me that I'm leading you to a better place. I'm leading you to a blessing. So sometimes we get in those moments where we're suffering intensely, and we're like, God, I just want to know where this is leading. But God just says, trust me, it's leading to a better place. And that's what Job did, and because of it, Job was blessed. Everything he had was doubled. I can't remember the exact numbers. I think he had like 5,000 camels, which is a lot. But, of course, those were taken away, so God replaces them with 10,000 camels, so he doubled it. And he does this with all of his cattle, except for his children, which his children are not cattle. But there seems to be something unique about human life. The animals that he had, God replaced them. They're replaceable. He took the 5,000 that he had before, gave him 5,000 more to replace them, and then 5,000 after that, so 10,000 total. But the kids, it said he had 10 kids before, and then after all this, he had 10 kids after that. So it seems as though there's something valuable about life, a human life, that can't be replaced. The 10 kids that Job had at first, he never lost. They were always in his heart. They were always going to be his children. Even though he lost them through death, they were still his kids. So God doesn't double them. He gives them 10 more, which doubled it overall. So life, human life, he seems to keep it as an overall. So it just seems as though there's something special about human life, to where Job's children were still doubled, but he didn't double them like he doubled the cattle, because he didn't replace the first 10 kids. The first 10 kids were still Job's kids. All right, so now let's go over the conclusion. First, God does not want us to suffer. However, he can use the suffering of this life to bless us, to help us. Sometimes we make mistakes, but God can still use those mistakes. I think of King David, how he made a terrible mistake. He slept with someone who wasn't his own wife, and she got pregnant. He tried to cover it up, so he ends up killing her husband and marrying her, which is the right thing to do if you're going to impregnate someone, to marry them, I guess, but maybe not kill their husband. Just don't impregnate people, I guess, especially other people's spouses. So anyways, but even though that was a terrible thing that he did, and that baby ended up dying, unfortunately, Solomon was born out of between him and that lady Bathsheba. After they got married, he was born, and he became the great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather of Jesus. So it seems as though even though we make mistakes, God can still use those mistakes to bring about a blessing. He doesn't want us to make mistakes. He can use our success too. But even if we make mistakes, God still plans to use them. And even when we're going through suffering, God can still use that to bless us. It just depends on how we handle it. Any situation can be either a blessing or a curse. It just depends on how we respond. What would have happened if Job had failed God's test? What if he had said, you know what, I'm tired. Sure, curse God. I'm going to just go give up life. Would he have ever received any of those blessings? No. What if Abraham had said, you know what, God, I like Isaac, and I don't believe that you can bring him back from the dead, so I'm not going to do what you've told me to do. It could have been that God would have chosen a completely different person to be the father of his nations. What if Joseph had just gotten bitter and said, I'm not going to help Pharaoh. Pharaoh's not done me any good. I'm just going to sit in my little cell and feel sorry for myself. He never would have blessed himself as well as blessed the nation surrounding him. What if Daniel had just gotten bitter at God for his suffering and said, whatever, I'm done serving God. He's not been helping me. I'm just gonna let the lions eat me. He never would have been a blessing to not just himself, but also to Israel, because he was the advisor of Cyrus as well. He helped advise Cyrus, who was the one who was allowed the children of Israel to go back to Israel after their captivity, which I think the senior pastor talked about last week. So the point is, any situation can be a blessing or a curse. It just depends on how we respond. If it's a bad situation, it could still be a blessing to us. We may not like the blessing, we may not like the situation, but it still has the potential to bless us. All right, let's go ahead and pray.